we will be picking up where we left off last week, still in the book of 2 Kings, and right now we're in 2 Kings chapter 8. 2 Kings chapter 8, looking at this thought of God's sovereignty, and of course starting now to get into some of these evil kings that are mentioned in the chapter. But before you get to the evil kings, you see God's sovereignty, His power, His authority, His control in the way that He provides. And so we talked from the first part of this particular chapter about some of the way that we see God's providence at work for the Shunammite woman, how it is that because of all the care that she had given to Elisha warns her about what's coming in the famine, so she goes to the land of Philistines for 7 years. She comes back at the end of that time, and what's the situation? What's going on in Samaria at that point when she goes to the king's palace? Conveniently, what's the king talking about? He's talking with Gehazi about her, right? Now they've been talking about Elisha and what Elisha's been doing, but just conveniently when this woman shows up, they're talking about what Elisha had done for her in raising her son from the dead. And so in that timing, the king, of course, turns to her now and he says, "Tell me, is it true?" And so she goes through everything. He recognizes, well, yes, it's true. He blesses her. We talked about the good application from that. And, of course, how God provides for her even when it is that she likely didn't know how it was going to come about. But in her faith, she knew that He would. And great application for us there. Then we looked at the middle part of the chapter at Hazael's takeover. And we see God's sovereignty in a special way in this section. Where is Hazael at? He's not in Israel, is he? Not in Judah, but he is in Syria, Damascus, right? So he is in a foreign nation. And so here we see God's sovereignty even over the people that are not His faithful people. They're not Israel. They're not the children of Israel, but they are a foreign nation. But we still see God's control, that God is fully sovereign, that He is able to, say what's going to happen. He knows what's going to happen. And that's what we have taking place in that situation with Hazael. But now we're going to come back to Judah and go back to God's people. We've mainly been focusing on Israel, but now we're going to look at Judah itself. And unfortunately, there are still some evil kings that we're going to see at this point in time in Judah. And so let's turn to 2 Kings chapter 8. And we'll have somebody read for us the start of this particular section we're looking at right now with Joram. And I'll have someone read 2 Kings 8, verses 16 to 18.
In the 5th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, Jehoshaphat having been king of Judah, Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, began to reign as king of Judah. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. And he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab had done. For the daughter of Ahab was his wife, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord.
All right, so we look in those verses and we learn about who this new king in Judah is going to be. Of course, we recognize from verse 16 that kind of gives some time frame, and I mentioned this earlier in the book of 2 Kings, that sometimes the timing seems a little bit confusing because at times one particular spot we see where maybe it mentions when they start reigning and it's kind of as a co-regent, so he's not the king alone, but then at another point it might mention a little bit of a different time frame, a few years off from the previous, and that's usually when it is that he becomes king standing alone. And so that's the way a lot of times that kind of shakes out when you really start to get into it. But recognizing where we are in the timing of things, it's in the 5th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, that now we find that Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, begins reigning as king of Judah. This gets confusing because even here in this particular section, we're going to see in just a handful of verses that Jehoram is also known as Joram. So you've got Joram in Israel, Joram in Judah. And I actually think we talked some about that in some of the earlier chapters. But you notice through these things some interesting connections at least. We know, verse 17, that he's 32. He reigned for 8 years in Jerusalem. And verse 18 is where you really start to see some of the connections, and you see the type of king that Jehoram or Joram was in Judah. How did he go about his life? How did he go about his reign? Look at the first part of verse 18. All right, he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. Specifically, he walked just like who? Just like Ahab. And that kind of makes sense because who was in Joram's house? Ahab's daughter. Right? So Ahab was his father-in-law. So we see how it is that these things are going about, and it's interesting, at least to me, because of the way words and English, and y'all know I'm weird about some of those things. But verse 18, how it all plays out, you have that he walked in the way of the kings of Israel just as the house of Ahab had done. Well, what's the reason? For the daughter of Ahab was his wife. So it seems like perhaps that Jehoram probably would have been at least a decent king, but he made a certain decision that affected the outcome of his life, affected the outcome of his reign. What was that decision? He chose to marry Ahab's daughter. Could have been for political reasons, could have been for, whatever it is. Maybe she was very beautiful, maybe she was coming with a bunch of money, I don't know. But whatever reason, he made the decision, and it had an impact on his life. You see a little bit more about the type of king that he was when we go into 2 Chronicles. There's a lot more detail about some of these kings in 2 Chronicles, and I don't want to necessarily get into all of it. But you see the way that certain decisions are made and how certain things are clouded because of the type of wicked king he was. If you go to 2 Chronicles 21, 2 Chronicles 21, and somebody when you get there read verse 4.
Now when Jehoram was established over the kingdom of his father, he strengthened himself and killed all his brothers with the sword, and also others of the princes of Israel.
So what does he do as soon as he becomes king? He kills anyone who would be a threat, whether they're a brother or a friend or a cousin or anyone. He kills them if they're a potential threat to the throne. And then you get down and somebody reads 2 Chronicles 21 and verse 11.
Moreover, he made high places in the mountains of Judah, and caused the inhabitants of Jerusalem to commit harlotry, and led Judah astray.
So now what do we see that he's done? He's led the people to idols, right? That's the sign in those high places. And we see throughout the Old Testament at times where it refers to that as harlotry. Now within that, there's certainly the spiritual sense of the harlotry because they are cheating on God, if you will. But a lot of times with that idol worship, the pagan worship, a lot of times there was a physical harlotry type sense to it. There would be harlots in these different temples and in these places. And some of that certainly would have gone into Judah or Israel when they were doing these things because they're becoming like everybody around them. But the point in looking at these particular places is to show Jehoram was not a good man. He was not a good king. And 2 Kings chapter 8 tells us why it is that he was wicked. Because of who it is that he chose to spend his life with. Now what type of a lesson do you think that might be teaching us? Be careful who you marry, right? Sometimes maybe we'll think in relationships, well, I know maybe they're not the best person, maybe they're not who they should be, but I can change them. More often than not, what happens? They change us. I don't know if that was the situation for Joram going in. Chances are he probably already had some problems that he was dealing with himself. But we recognize nonetheless, based on the way that it's spelled out for us here in the text, that a lot of the reason he was the way he was, a lot of the reason that he follows in the steps of Ahab, wicked king of Israel, is because who he chooses to marry. It's an important lesson for us to consider, an important lesson for us to teach to our children and to our grandchildren. Because you might just turn out more like them than they might turn out like you. And that can be a hard lesson for us to consider, but it's one that needs to be considered because it's right here, very applicable in the text. And so we keep moving on. Or Johnny, did I see your hand a second ago?
Well, I was just gonna say, it seemed like she would have chosen someone who she knew would not be her complete opposite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And even then, when you think about what that could have potentially entailed, walking in the ways of Ahab. A lot of times when you look back in 1 Kings, it seems like who is it that was actually calling a lot of the shots? Jezebel, a lot of times. So maybe some of it, to your point, Johnny, is also that she saw someone she could manipulate and someone who she could kind of control in that way. That's just kind of some assumption, but we can see the way that might be playing out in it. But we recognize, of course, Joram's evil. We see the type of man he was, the things he did, just in brief at least as king, how he led the people astray. But then within this, and seeing God's sovereignty, we can recognize his great mercy. Somebody read 2 Kings 8 and verse 19.
Yet the Lord would not destroy Judah for the sake of his servant David, as he promised him to give a lamp to him and his sons forever.
So why does God not just take out Judah at this point? Because of the promise that he made, all getting back to his mercy. What promise did he make to David?
That you would always have a son on the throne.
That throne would stand forever, right? Go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7. 2 Samuel chapter 7. And it's been a while since there's been any mention of this specific promise, but this is one of the key promises in the Old Testament as it eventually gets us to Jesus, who is the Christ. 2 Samuel chapter 7. And if you write in your Bible, I'd encourage you probably there next to where the mention of the promise in 2 Kings chapter 8 and verse 19. I would probably write down there 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 down through verse 16. Because that's exactly what it's going back to. But if somebody has it, would you read 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 16?
When your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. And if he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the blows of the sons of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever.
And so we recognize within this promise, as it was mentioned, that God is promising David that there would be one who would sit on his throne forever. But even within this, we can see from verse 14, as Benjamin read, that if he commits sin, I'll chasten him with the rod of men, with the blows of the sons of men. But what's verse 15 say? My mercy shall not depart from him. What we're finding at this point is we're learning more about who God is, and we're learning a great deal about his character. Because what is it that should have happened to Jehoram and Judah at this point? They should have been wiped out. You've got one who's going in as the leader of God's people, and he's going in and killing all of his brothers and anyone who would be a threat to the throne. And then beyond that, he is causing the people to commit harlotry just like all the nations around them, and going to the high places and worshiping all of these idols. He was successful as king in turning the people away from God, was he not? What should God have done? He should have wiped them out. But what kept God from doing it? His mercy, his patience, the fact that he is true to his word. How often is it that we do things, maybe not to the degree that Joram did, but how often do we do things that we deserve really to just be taken out, to be destroyed? But why is it that we're not? because of God's mercy. It's because of certain promises that He has made. When it is that we abuse those things, we are taking advantage of God's goodness, and it should never be that way. We should never willingly be taking advantage of the Lord's mercy and of His patience, because we know, even looking through the Old Testament, eventually that patience and that mercy leads to His justice, which means that if things don't change, destruction is coming. Devastation is coming. And we know 2 Peter chapter 3, when you get there, that we find that the reason the world hasn't ended yet is because God is patient. 2 Peter 3 and verse 14. He's merciful. He's sovereign. He's powerful. He's in control. And so in the midst of all of this darkness that we see taking place, be it in Damascus, be it now in Judah or in Israel, as we've been seeing through 2 Kings, if we can remember who's in control and who's behind it all, who it is that's merciful, who it is that's patient, who it is that's sovereign, we can begin to get a clearer picture of who God is and even the love that He has for us. And so that's what we have going on right here in the middle of this section with Joram. But there's still more to be said about what it is that happens in Joram's reign. And we find these revolting nations. Somebody read now 2 Kings chapter 8, verses 20 to 22.
In his days, Edom revolted against Judah's authority and made a king over themselves. So Joram went to Zair and all his chariots with him. Then he rose by night and attacked the Edomites who had surrounded him, the captain of the chariots, the captains of the chariots, and the troops fled to their tents. Thus Edom has been in revolt against Judah's authority to this day, and Libnah revolted at that time.
So we're finding then some of these nations that are beginning to revolt against Judah during the reign of Joram. It talks about how it is that he goes to Zair, showing a map, kind of trying to help put it in perspective. You got Jerusalem here, which is, of course, where Joram would have been reigning from. And then down here is kind of roughly where Zair would have been in the area of Edom. And so that's roughly where we are. And Joram goes down there with his troops and goes down by night to attack them. And what happened? The Edomites surrounded them. And then it says the troops fled to their tents. Now, within that, there's some difference of thought of what some have understood that to mean. Is this talking about the troops of the Edomites, that they fled? Or is this talking about Joram's troops themselves when they were surrounded by the Edomites? And I think what makes the most sense here is to recognize that it's saying that the troops of Joram fled. Because this is why this rebellion continues to happen. This revolt is still continuing to take place at the time at which these things were written here in 2 Kings. And then as you keep going, you see it's not just Edom that was revolting, but there's a mention of another nation. Who else was revolting at that time against Judah? Libnah. It's just this one little mention. Nothing really else is said about it here in the Kings. But showing you this map, Libnah is much closer to Jerusalem. Again, Jerusalem right here, and Libnah probably would have been about right there. So it's not too far from Jerusalem, and rather than a nation, this is a particular city that was revolting against the king. You have something, Jared?
It's just interesting how you read through, all this history, and when you have a king that is ruling how he should and guiding the people in the direction they need to go, they have less enemies.
Yeah.
They have less problems. They have less turmoil in their life. And then you find a king like this one who is turning them back to idols, and all of a sudden here you have all these people that are pressing in against him again.
Right.
And that's the pattern that you continue to see.
Yeah.
How much harder their life is simply because of the decisions that they're making.
Yeah, and like you say, with these problems, you start to see, because of their unfaithfulness, the problems are not just from without, but it's problems from within. Like you mentioned, when everything's going well, you see that there's peace, that you really see expansion of the kingdom. So you had the Edomites who at one time were paying tribute, were faithful and loyal to the king of Judah, but now at this point, because of unfaithfulness, they are turning against him, revolting against him. Problems from without, but now you've got also problems from within, because Libnah is not a foreign nation. It's not a separate group of people, but this is people who are in Judah. these are children of God. And it's interesting, the more that we start to try to figure out about Libnah, if you go to Joshua chapter 21, Joshua chapter 21, you find when all of the tribes are being allotted their specific land. And you remember when it came to the tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi did not get a large territory, did they? But what did the tribe of Levi receive among all of the territories? They received cities. And if you look in Joshua 21, it's in verse 13, we find that the city of Libnah was actually one of these cities that was given to the Levites. So what we have then is this city of Levites. And remember, the Levites was the only tribe from which a priest could come. Not all well, it's like the all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares thing, right? All priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. So certainly there would have been some priests within the city, but you recognize what we have here is a very important tribe of people within this city that now is turning and revolting against the king. And if we go to 2 Chronicles, I'll get to you in a second, Benjamin. If you go to 2 Chronicles and you look in chapter 21 where we were earlier, 2 Chronicles chapter 21 and in verse 10, it gives us the reason why it is that this city is revolting against the king. And it goes back to Jared's point because of his unfaithfulness. The 2 Chronicles chapter 21 and verse 10, you find there, Edom has been revolt against Judah's authority to this day. And then it's the second part of the verse that we're focusing on. At that time, Libnah revolted against his rule because he had what? Forsaken the Lord God of his fathers. In the midst of this nation that's beginning to turn away and is being led astray by this wicked king who's following in the way of his wife, following after her family and Ahab, we still find that there were some who remained faithful. That there was always a remnant of the faithful of God's people. And that's what we have in Libnah. They were not going to stand for Joram's unfaithfulness. They were not going to follow in his wicked and in his evil. But instead, they were going to stand up and rebel against him if that's what it meant to stand firm for the truth of God. I wish that we had more about maybe what some of that looked like, that we knew some of maybe the key players in that. But that's not the purpose of the Kings right now. The purpose of this history is showing how it is that the nation continued to turn and continued to grow further and further and further away from God. But we still at least get these little glimpses at times of the faithfulness of those who were truly God's people. And that's what we have in Libnah. But let's look at these. Before we look at the last couple verses, Benjamin, you had something, brother?
Oh, no, I was back in Joshua 21:13. I noticed it was Hebron, its common land, a city of refuge for the slave.
Mm-hmm.
And then it mentions Libnah.
Right.
Common land.
Yes.
And I was just thinking about, okay, he started out by killing everyone close to him.
Mm-hmm.
Have sole possession of power.
Yeah, thinking about Joram.
And I just, that was kind of a hiding.
Right.
Hiding for a city.
Yeah, there in Hebron.
Because you're going to be brought to justice if you go about it the wrong way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, good God redeems his people.
That's right.
So, I mean, the outcome, the final results of all this is disastrous.
Mm-hmm.
Because, it's like who's next in line. And the entire line, the lineage of all these kings, says David. There were maybe one who did a good enough job. He was remembered for it.
Mm-hmm.
They were all they were just times.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we see the way that the people respond even to Joram and his death. It's really a pretty disturbing thing to look at. If you look in these last couple of verses here about Joram, somebody read 2 Kings chapter 8, verses 23 and 24.
Now the rest of the acts of Joram and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So Joram rested with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. Then Ahaziah, his son, reigned in his place.
All right, so we have here just kind of this final summation. Talks about the rest of the acts of Joram being in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. We talked about that when we got into the book of 2 Kings, some of these mentions of different books. That's not the 1st and 2nd Chronicles that we have. This was evidently some other record of history in Judah of these kings, the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. And so they could have gone and seen more. That's something they had access to. We don't have access to it today, but that really doesn't change anything because we know what we need to know about Joram, just even based on the little bit that's here. Then, of course, you have that kind of typical ending of their reign. He rested with his fathers, meaning he'd passed away. He's buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Ahaziah, his son, reigned in his place. And we read that, and you're thinking maybe, okay, Preston, you said that it's kind of disturbing when you look at the end of his life, and that seems very tame. Well, let's go to 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles chapter 21, and back to Benjamin's point just a moment ago, that really it ends in devastation and in destruction, and that's really how Joram's life comes to a close. 2 Chronicles chapter 21. Read with me, if you would, beginning in verse 18. After all this, the Lord struck him in his intestines with an incurable disease. Then it happened in the course of time, after the end of 2 years, that his intestines came out because of his sickness, so he died in severe pain. And his people made no burning for him like the burning for his fathers. He was 32 years old when he became king. He reigned in Jerusalem 8 years, and to no one's sorrow departed. However, they buried him in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. Like I said, a little bit disturbing. But you see how seriously God takes sin. Why was Joram having to deal with those things? It's because he was a wicked king, and the Lord did what? The Lord struck him with that incurable disease. And it wasn't something that took him out overnight, but after 2 years, it said, the intestines came out, terrible, painful way for him to die. And when he died, what's the response of the people? Good riddance, right? And the people weren't even sad. They weren't sorry about it. To no one's sorrow, he departed. They were just waiting for the day. And of course, they at least go ahead and bury him in the city of David, but they don't bury him who? Or where? In the tombs of the kings. Joram probably didn't think it was going to end that way, but it does, because God is in control, and the wicked will never prevail, be it in life, be it in death. And so we keep going then, because 2 Kings chapter 8 is not over yet. We've still got another wicked king, and we've sort of been introduced to him already, because when we learn from 2 Kings 8 verse 24 that Joram has died, we find that Ahaziah, his son, is now going to reign in his place. So let's look then at the remainder of this chapter where we find Ahaziah reigning in Judah. Let's have somebody read 2 Kings 8 verses 25 to 27.
In the 12th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, began to reign. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri, king of Israel. And he walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, and did evil in the sight of the Lord, like the house of Ahab, for he was the son-in-law of the house of Ahab.
So we find then how Ahaziah, the time frame he comes to reign. Verse 25 tells us it's in the 12th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel. And so not Joram of Judah, but Joram of Israel it goes back to for our time marker. Ahaziah begins to reign. He's 22 years old. How long does he reign? He reigns only for 1 year, so it's pretty short-lived that he's king. But even though it was very short-lived, he evidently made an impact. Because what type of a king was he? He's an evil king. What were you going to say, Miss Betty?
He was the same.
He was just like his father, right? Interestingly enough, it's not just like his father, but it's also just like his father-in-law, who was his father's father-in-law. Things get confusing when we start looking at the family trees, don't they? Right? We know that Ahaziah's father, Joram, was married to Ahab's daughter. That's the reference it gives. But what's the reference and the connection it gives when you look now at Ahaziah? He was the son-in-law of Ahab. Things get very confusing. Things get really messy when you get into sin, and everything starts to get confusing in every aspect of life, because sin, just matter of fact, is very messy. So we see the type of reign that that Ahaziah had as a king in his 1 year. It was wicked. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He walked in the way of the house of Ahab. And because he's walking in the way of the house of Ahab, then it really shouldn't be much of a surprise when we begin to see who his allies are. Somebody read now 2 Kings 8, verses 28 and 29.
He went with Joram, the son of Ahab, to war against Hazael, king of Syria, at Ramoth Gilead, and the Syrians wounded Joram. Then King Joram went back to Jezreel to recover from the wounds which the Syrians had inflicted on him at Ramoth, when he fought against Hazael, king of Syria. And Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, went down to see Joram, the son of Ahab, in Jezreel, because he was sick.
So you look at verse 28, and where is Ahaziah going, and who's he going with?
With Joram.
All right, so he's going with Joram, king of Israel, to do what?
Make war against Hazael, king of Syria.
All right, so to fight against Hazael. Now, you look back previously in the chapter, and Elisha was very distraught because of what he knew based on what the Lord had revealed to him that Hazael was going to do. You look back in around verse 12 of 2 Kings chapter 8, and you see where it is that there's the mention of how Hazael is just going to wreak havoc on the people of God. And now we find at this point, a few years after the fact that Hazael has been become king in Syria, what's Hazael beginning to do? We start to see that he's beginning to wreak havoc on the people. Evidently, there's a need for them to go to war at Ramoth Gilead. I did not put it on the map this time, but next week I should have it on the map there of Ramoth Gilead, that we can see kind of exactly where we are. But right now we find how it is in this particular battle that they go to. The Syrians wound Joram. Joram goes back to Jezreel, verse 29, so he can recover from his wounds when he fought against Hazael. And as he's recovering from his wounds, we find that Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, goes down to see him in Jezreel because he was sick. And that's where 2 Kings chapter 8 ends. Now, there's more that we're going to find about this, because really the narrative continues into chapter 9, and we'll pick up sort of right there where it leaves off a little bit later into chapter 9. But something I do want to note that we find in the Chronicles, just a specific phrase that's said. Somebody go to 2 Chronicles 22. 2 Chronicles chapter 22, because as we're noting God's sovereignty through these things, this is how it is we're going to see God's sovereignty in Ahaziah's reign as he goes down to Jezreel in order to see Joram, who was sick. Very first part of 2 Chronicles 22, and I'll go ahead and read it. Very first part of that verse in verse 7. His going to Joram was God's occasion for Ahaziah's downfall. And so there we see, again, God's power, God's authority, God's control. He goes down to Jezreel, and that's going to be his downfall. We don't know how it's going to come about yet, but when we get into 2 Kings chapter 9, we're going to see exactly how that downfall takes place. And so there we find Ahaziah's reign, at least in part, and it's about to come to an end in chapter 9. But as we look at 2 Kings chapter 8 as we come to a close, we have the takeaways that we want to mention. First and foremost, we can learn from this chapter that God will take care of the faithful. And that goes back up to the first 6 or 7 verses there as it relates to the Shunammite and the way that the Lord provides for her. Secondly, we can find that God is omniscient, meaning God is all-knowing. We see this, of course, within His sovereignty, but we recognize how He knows what Hazael is going to do before Hazael ever does it. Now, Hazael still has free will in the matter. He had the choice to make. We talked about that a little bit last week, but we recognize God's omniscience, and we, of course, recognize how that plays into His sovereignty. And then lastly, as we talked about specifically from verse 19 of the chapter, God is a merciful God. That was true then, and it still stands true today. So that's where we'll finish up this morning. And Lord willing, next week we'll get into 2 Kings chapter 9.